background checks. Background checks pursuant to the current law are processed by the FBI. And, Mr. Chair, gentlemen, and we had this conversation, there is no registry of folks getting background checks. And I had a discussion with the representative for Bernalillo saying I was uncomfortable with the registration policy, but that is not part of this current law. It is not. It's been taken out in the massive amount of work that has been done on this bill. So just to reiterate again, Mr. Speaker, only federal firearms licensees may call or electronically contact the NICS for these background checks. Mr. Speaker, polling has shown that not only do NRA supporters, as my colleague from Bernalillo pointed out, support this measure, but a recent national poll from the University of Chicago found that 77.5% of respondents in the United States agreed that laws requiring purchasers of firearms from unlicensed vendors go through a background check for all the reasons that have been stated. And in a study of police chiefs, opinions on firearms regulations are very one-sided. 93.5% of police chiefs supported background checks for all handgun purchases, and 82.2% supported background checks for all rifle and shotgun purchases, because they want to make sure that people who are getting these firearms have shown responsibility in their lives. That's all we're asking for here. And in response to Representative Rauch's comments, saying that none of the tragedies that have been up in the media recently came from gun shows, which is a fair point, but there was an ATF study done in the 2000s that showed 1,530 traffic investigations over 2.5 years, and that gun shows were the second leading source of illegally diverting guns in the nation. And specifically in the New Orleans, Louisiana area, the ATF specifically pointed out that gang members there were going to gun shows and purchasing guns from unlicensed dealers so they didn't have to do a background check. So there has been evidence that folks use this loophole to get firearms, to use them for illegal activities. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to go off and talk about some of the arguments that have been used against these and talk about some of the reasons why they're probably not applicable to this bill. There's an argument that this bill currently before us violates the Second Amendment right of New Mexicans to keep and bear arms. Mr. Speaker, as has been pointed out by my colleague from Bernalillo County, this does no such thing. There is no new gun policy being put into place in House Bill 77, period. There's no new gun policy. It simply creates consistency in gun show purchases, ensuring that those who buy guns from private vendors are held to the exact same standards as those who buy guns from federal firearms licensees, pursuant to federal law. And I don't think that that's such a bad thing. Mr. Chair, there's a argument that the FFLs will be liable for background checks conducted for third parties at gun shows. And the reality of the situation, Mr. Speaker, is that immunity has been provided in the bill for FFLs who perform these checks, protecting them from liability, as long as they cannot reasonably know that the purchaser is likely to commit an unlawful act with the firearm or intends to deliver the firearm to a third party who the FFL knows or should reasonably know is prohibited from owning a firearm. So that argument is being taken care of in the language of the bill. If I'm an FFL and I go to a gun show and I participate in this process, I'm not going to be held liable for following the law. Mr. Speaker, there's an argument out there that the Firearm Transfer Act puts an unnecessary burden on law-abiding citizens, as most transfers of guns between private individuals are safe and do not require a background check. Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality of the situation is, until all firearms exchanges include background checks, we cannot truly know the frequency with unlicensed private citizens, knowingly or unknowingly, sell guns to persons who are prohibited from owning them. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to address that situation, that this is putting an undue burden. Of the 5 guns that I own, 3 I inherited and 2 I purchased at gun stores, 1 in Las Cruces and 1 in Animas. And the background checks that took place were both less than 5 minutes. I was able to find the firearm that I wanted, check it out, talk about price with the retailer, and that retailer then went back, got on a phone, called, came back out, and it was quick. It was unburdensome. Mr. Speaker, there's a myth that enacting that this bill would reduce the penalty for unlawful transfer of a firearm to a prohibited individual, because under federal law it's a felony. However, in this current law, the crime is a misdemeanor. The reality of the situation is federal gun laws are not really strongly enforced, and the penalty for a crime is meaningless if no one enforces it. So this additional oversight mandated by the bill will provide for more oversight of these transactions. Mr. Speaker, there's a myth out there, an argument that criminals acquire firearms primarily through illegal channels. So this bill will have little impact on illegal purchases, primarily impacting law-abiding citizens. And many of the guns used in mass shootings and more commonplace crimes do have their origins at gun shows. In fact, a memo by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms found that gun shows were a major trafficking channel. I've already talked about this bill, but there is evidence out there that folks use this, for lack of a better word, and with respect to my friend the gentleman from earlier, loophole in getting weapons to use to do bad things. We shouldn't have this. Mr. Speaker, there's a myth out there that it is unreasonable to threaten gun show promoters with criminal penalties for failing to arrange for one or more FFLs to be present at a gun show where private individuals will be selling guns. So, Mr. Speaker, I would actually make the argument that this bill, HB 77, is good for gun show promoters. By reducing the incidence of undocumented private transfers of firearms at these shows, this bill will make gun shows safer places for firearm vendors and purchasers. This benefit far outweighs the very, very, very small extra effort that has to be put into place by a gun show promoter to make sure that an FFL is there so that folks can buy these guns legally. It is also uncommon that gun shows don't have an FFL around. In fact, I believe the ATF estimates that between 50% and 75% of vendors at gun shows currently are FFLs and currently do background checks. So finding ways for folks to be able to sell these guns if they don't have an FFL cannot be that hard to do. Mr. Speaker, excuse me, I've heard so many arguments about this, and I've gotten as many emails as everybody else. I've probably gotten about the same amount of emails from folks wanting this bill as opposing this bill. But the ones that I find the most probably disconcerting are the ones from folks who are opposing this bill, and they use the word burdensome. They use the word onerous. They use the word blockade. You're stopping us from getting the guns that we want. And Mr. Speaker, this is just not true. The cost of getting a background check through an FFL is currently non-existent. And it is up to the private dealer in this bill to find a reasonable fee for an FFL to be able to do a background check. So it's not going to take any more time, and it's not going to cost you probably any more money. And if a private dealer or an FFL decides to charge a small fee, it won't be onerous. So the argument that this bill will be providing a blockade for folks to be able to get guns legally simply has no leg to stand on. Mr. Speaker, there is a myth that the mandated background check is a laborious extra step. We kind of talked about that. I guess, Mr. Speaker, when you decide to sell at a gun show, and there's been an argument in the past that this is my private collection. I'm not a dealer, I'm not a retailer, but I want to go to a gun show and have some sales through these private guns that I own that are in my locker or whatever. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that when you go to a gun show to sell firearms, you are choosing to become a retailer. You are choosing to participate in a process where folks can come randomly and shop like they would in a store. So making the argument that this is my private sale and you're getting in the way of me selling my guns to whoever wants to buy it, Mr. Speaker, frankly, that person made that choice to enter a different definition by choosing to go and sell at that gun show. And if it's not going to really make any bit of a difference putting these units we talked about, then I think that it's a good option for all the safety measures I talked about at the beginning of this little speech. Background checks are a good thing. Responsibility is a good thing. This is not about insulting gun owners, and I feel like with a lot of my friends that are firearms owners and a lot of the folks that have sent me emails and called, there's a sense that this is insulting people who own guns, saying you're evil, you're doing a bad thing, we're gonna try to make this more of a burden for you. And that is not what this is trying to do. All we're trying to say is that there are reasons to keep certain people from owning firearms. Good reasons. good enough that no one's trying to stop the process at regular gun stores. So if these are good reasons, all we're trying to say is let's put in that little extra effort to stop folks who might want to use this process to be able to get guns illegally because they have some problems in their past. Mr. Speaker, I keep hearing this argument that we're infringing on our Second Amendment rights. Well, I used to teach Government 100 at New Mexico State University in Doñana Community College. And this was one of the arguments we always had about where you draw the line. And I would always ask about the Second Amendment. How many of you support the Second Amendment? A lot of folks would raise their hands. I raise my hand. But then I say, okay, in the Second Amendment, it allows you right to bear quote-unquote arms. Should that include a nuclear weapon? Not many people said that that was a good thing. Okay, how about an M1 Abrams tank with a 105mm cannon? Would you be comfortable with your neighbor having that weapon next to you? Not many people said yes, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. We don't allow automatic weapons in this country. There's no real push to allow someone to own an M60 fully automatic machine gun. Because having those, putting those in the wrong hands is extremely dangerous, or could be extremely dangerous to those around us. So our interpretation of the Second Amendment is one that everybody has a different definition of. And I'm okay currently with not allowing automatic weapons. I'm okay not allowing people to have a tank. And I'm okay not allowing people to have a nuclear weapon. So saying that the right to bear arms is something that shouldn't be infringed upon is infringed upon every day for good reason. And to make the argument that this bill, by instituting a policy that already is in place for good reason, simply just doesn't work. Mr. Speaker, Representatives, this is a bipartisan bill. Representative Gentry has shown intelligence and foresight in working with the folks over here to get an amendment in on the bill that does some pretty good things, including working on the mental health situation that a lot of people talk about. And I agree with that. The governor supports this bill, Mr. Speaker. So when we talk about folks coming together and working on a bipartisan level, this bill is the definition of what folks want, at least from my district. Closing this gun show loophole, Mr. Speaker, is about consistency. Federal firearms licenses are already required. Let's be consistent. Will it stop the problem of people getting guns? No, Mr. Speaker, it will not. But putting a law into place that outlaws murder doesn't stop people from murdering either. What it does say is we, as a community, as a state, have certain standards that we ask our constituents to live by. And in order to have a firearm, we're asking you to take some responsibility for your actions. Will this help? I do believe so. Yes, some folks are going to find ways to get around it. But that does not mean that we should say, okay, have one lane for those of you that want to have a background check, and have another lane for those of you that want to ignore the law because you're worried about stuff in your past. Mr. Speaker, this bill is moderate. It is bipartisan. It is consistent. It is intelligent. It has been worked on very, very hard, and I encourage all those members here in the chamber to vote yes on this responsible piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, gentlemen. I give my time.